So I will take a few moments before I pass the podium over to official business to really offer a few thoughts on the importance of this day where we celebrate and acknowledge Philip's career at Waterloo Architecture. And as I was preparing for this, I realized that I actually don't know a Waterloo Architecture without Philip Beasley. I joined as a tenure-track faculty member at the school in 2011, a year where Philip was celebrating his 15th year at the school through a promotion to full professor. In marking his retirement this evening, we celebrate and reflect on just about 30 years of service to the school and the community. Philip's career is truly remarkable. The breadth of arenas in which his work has made lasting contributions is inspiring. His work, now largely contained within the Living Architecture Systems Group umbrella, is multifaceted, robust, intense, and incredibly agile. Gaining traction in leading scholarly societies such as Acadia and the American Society for Cybernetics, while also engaging in public-facing and accessible dissemination and exchanges through world-class exhibitions, outreach programs, and multidisciplinary ventures into worlds of theater and fashion, and of course, Riverside Press. So an impressive H-index and a shout out in Vogue is a rare combination in one CV, and it's one that makes me smile. Since becoming the director, I've witnessed Philip recognized in two incredibly meaningful ways. His promotion to university professor in 2023 recognizes the importance of Philip's scholarly achievements and the international preeminence that he's built. The following year in 2024, Philip received the Acadia Design Excellence Award, which recognizes a career-long commitment and innovation to design and innovation and impact to the fields of architecture and computational design. Together, these two awards bundle a set of concerns that I know many of us around here aspire to. And for me, they characterize Philip's career. First, commitment to excellence. Second, staying power and resilience. And third, transformational impact. More personally, I was reflecting on Philip's impact in my own career, in my own life, and I often reflect on his insistence that we never stop short of striving for excellence in everything we do across all of our work at the school. Sometimes it would have been easier to concede or scale back aspirations, but hearing his call and registering this ambition on numerous occasions across any matter at the school has made Waterloo Architecture a better place. For me, the second point of inspiration lies in Philip's relentless belief in the power of interdisciplinary integration as a key driver for the future of architecture. As someone who themselves arrived at architecture in a disciplinarily roundabout way, I feel a sense of belonging and value in my potential as part of this community. I'm grateful for that framing, both in terms of the broader implications and the future of the built world, but also on this personal level. So on behalf of our community, thank you, Philip. Your commitments to shaping and sustaining the project that is Waterloo Architecture have been amazing. So let's give him a round of applause. So now I have the pleasure of introducing the person who will introduce Philip Beasley, and that's Eric Burry. Eric Burry is a former student of Philip's, a former studio colleague, and currently works at Eventscape, leading their operations that span both obviously within the GTA, but more broadly in North America. So welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Maya. Maya established, my name is Eric Berry. I was a student here once, coincidentally also started at the University of Waterloo in 1996, albeit under a different hat. I wasn't a particularly good student. My biggest distinction is that I think I received the very last Bachelor of Architecture degree granted by this school, having neglected to submit my intent to graduate form in a timely fashion. And also claim somewhat that I've left a mark on this school. There's some evidence of some double-sided sticky tape still remaining on these walls here. Statute of limitations passed. I think I've gotten away with it, but I do apologize. I got to know Philip and his wonderful family quite well while working in his studio practice for several years. So when he reached out to let me know that about this lecture and the reason behind it, it didn't make sense. I've never known an off to the Philip switch. I'm not even sure there's a standby mode. I've been wrestling with how to approach this introduction. I don't think there's much benefit in me reciting a bio or a CV. As a career academic, a biography worthy of a New York Times obituary accompanies every paper, exhibit opening, and grant application. A Google search, I'm sure, will turn up a dozen pretty thorough summaries of his career. I could try to speak about his artistic work, maybe offer some perspective or context, but I couldn't do nearly as good a job as Philip is about to. Perhaps instead, you'll permit me to dwell for a few moments on who Philip is through the lens of my own experience. Shortly after graduating, I was in Toronto looking for work, and being unemployed with extra free time on my hands, I answered, perhaps naively, one of his volunteer calls as he and his team were in the preparation of Implant Matrix, an installation at the Toronto Inter-Access Gallery. And before long, and maybe perhaps not unlike a lobster slowly coming to a boil, I transitioned from a casual volunteer to an active volunteer to an employee. A cycle that has repeated itself with so many other unwitting but absolutely special, amazing friends and colleagues over the years. Within a month, I had found myself helping to manage that same Implant Matrix installation, involved in organizing a conference, starting to work on the graphic design of a book, and getting familiar with the ins and outs of the multifaceted network of art grant applications. Not to mention learning how to troubleshoot a laser cutter and how to source acrylic sheets in industrial quantities. The next 7 or 8 years were quite the ride. Our time together took me to places like New Orleans, Madrid, Quebec City, Salt Lake City, and all the way to Venice to exhibit at the Canadian Pavilion in the Giardini of the Biennale. Closer to home, we orchestrated massive pop-up installations at Kerner Hall for Nuit Blanche and Calatrava's Brookfield Place atrium for Illuminato. Along the way, there were more conferences. That first book grew into the Riverside Architectural Press, and we churned through countless more funding applications. That studio had become an island of misfit toys, drawing into its orbit so many truly diverse and amazing people who, through many late nights together, developed a type of esprit de corps bond that is as rare as it is profound. A random sampling of a typical day could include driving shape memory alloys with custom microprocessors, organizing international shipments, talking fashion with world-famous designers, having debates about the point at which chemistry becomes life, hunting for widows and orphans in a printer's proof copy, or, given the law of averages, most likely combining tiny, often sharp, laser-cut pieces of acrylic into slightly larger pieces of acrylic assemblies. None of that would have happened without Philip's seemingly bottomless superhuman drive. Now, of course, it could be grueling to be in that orbit. Philip is equal parts determination and imagination. And each of these installations is mountain after mountain of effort, requiring thousands of hours of designing, managing, making, coding, and installing, only made possible through the combined efforts of dozens of colleagues, students, and volunteers, all working at full capacity. It was rewarding as hell, but it was also exhausting. After a few years at this, I developed a theory about what I called the Beasley impossibility field, co-opting a term associated with Steve Jobs. Maybe you felt something similar in your interactions with Philip. When Philip is trying to get you on board with some Herculean task, some impossible demand that you know is going to require uncommon effort, you can get swayed by the ether of his conviction, by the sincerity of his appreciation, and by the fact that he doesn't expect anything more from you than he expects of himself. And I need to stop here to make the point that this isn't only in the support of his own work, but in whatever pursuit, preoccupation, or project that is personally meaningful to you as a student, a colleague, or a friend. His genuine belief that not only is it possible, but is absolutely worthwhile starts becoming your belief too. It isn't until later, once the fugue has lifted, that you begin to come to terms with what you just agreed to. But by then it's too late. So if we're gathered here to mark a retirement, this is what I consider to be Philip's true legacy. Undoubtedly, his academic output and artistic body of work are worthy of celebration, but Philip's unique superpower, if there is such a thing, is to make you realize that the limits that you set for yourself are artificial. that the breadth of your potential is so much more vast than you realize. Sure, it will involve giving more of yourself than you were perhaps prepared to give at first. But once the dust settles, and maybe after your fingertips heal, what you've been able to pull off is so much greater than you would have ever dreamed possible. I'm not sure what more you could ask of a teacher. Please welcome the guy who put discipline in interdisciplinary, my good friend, Philip Beasley.
Friends, colleagues, thank you. Thank you so much, Maya. Thank you so much, Eric, for those words. I'm going to speak for a little less than an hour. I hope that's okay. Some of the things that I'm going to share, I feel rather shy about. Inevitably, this is a juncture with extraordinary turbulence of emotions with it. Hope, happiness, sorrow, some shame over what was not done, pride for what was done, love. When I walked in the building today, first walked in the project room in the exhibition, and I felt, oh my goodness me, the school is in very, very good hands. What a wonderful exhibition. And then I walked to the second floor, and I found my colleagues in the front office and just found such extraordinary warmth, real, tangible sense that collects our community together and that opens each other and that supports each other. And it was a delicious experience. The talk that I'm going to give is for Rowena Quest and for our beloved Thomas Seabohm as well, two beloved past members of the school. I'm going to weave together a series of works, and those works are going to try to offer justification for some optimism, purpose, possibility in a time when it seems necessary also to acknowledge grief and unspeakable uncertainty. I'm going to try to draw on some lessons from outside of our own species, encouragements about what is possible. Life. And let me begin then, just before I start the structured part, by trying to invoke some terms, because this is going to be at the heart of the talk. I'm going to try to suggest that words matter and that some of the terms we use might offer some rather different implications than what I think of. For example, when I think of this triad of words, which is so fundamental to architecture, firmitas, permanence by Vitruvius, space itself, the void, the forum that we act in as architects, the pomerium, the charmed circuit that went around Roma Quadrata or any city or any place that creates that place and that holds such claim and such magic and such a shell and such power as well. I won't dwell too much on those terms right now. I'm going to come back to them. But I do want to just gloss the sense of what they mean to me now, and perhaps to you as well. The sense that when we hear this paradigm in architecture of firmitas, I think of permanence, fixity, stasis, the eternal. When I hear the word space, I think of how I was taught as a rather proud atheist in my childhood, I'll admit it, that things are empty, that nothingness is a reality that somehow gives pride and possibility. When I think of the rather technical Latin term pomerium, I think of claim, of domain, of making shells, of making necessary walls. Are these the ingredients, the inevitable ingredients of our architecture? This talk will try to offer some replacements for those terms. I'm going to use the word metastable, a word that involves oscillation and shifting. I'm going to offer a different word for space, a word that Einstein, in fact, used, ether, the fulsomeness of every possibility redolent in the ground, rather than a kind of a zero. Rather than the shell, I'm going to try to speak about an envelope, which is a threshold of exchange and indeed sharing that might be an envelope for architecture. And these terms then, I hope, will be a contribution to a speculation that some new disciplines are emerging amongst us. Disciplines that are drawn rather than the static and the purely fixed measures of architecture on the practice of creating life. So there's 6 parts that I'm going to skip through. They're not going to skip through, actually. The first will be a skip, but the rest will be dwelling. I'll give a glimpse of some projects just to familiarize those who don't know the work with some of the taste of it. Then I'm going to speak about something that I discovered just this past year, a painting that speaks of a practice of artlessness and precarity and extraordinary fertility. I'll try to define that by the term apophasis, which is a term from rhetoric, meaning not arguing, not pushing, kind of an opening. Then I'm going to go through a number of shared works, a survey of projects. I'm going to offer some practical craft, some rather particular techniques that Eric and I first developed, along with many other colleagues. And then I'm going to try to revisit those 3 terms that I introduced just a moment ago, dwelling on them, offering some practical ways into constructing some alternatives. And I hope that then that will result in a reflection that might be a contribution to the emerging practice of living architecture. The work that my colleagues and I are doing now is rather deeply interwoven, deeply immersive, made of many, many elements that weave together using filamentary, extruded, expanded elements that earn their substance somehow by textile craft, using minimums of material, but deep substance. They tend to be quite saturated. They're interwoven with liquids as well, with a lurking sense of the emergence of living qualities, vibrating, singing, chorusing. They make large canopies. They're very often suspended, but they can be freestanding as well. I hope that even though they have some non-orthogonal, non-urban language, that they can be seen as a fundamental kind of architecture and a contribution to architectonics as well. And interwoven them in them as well, in the sense of this being a deeply dynamic milieu, is the behavior, sometimes ecstatic, sometimes murmuring, of deep exchange of primary information and as well of dance, of stirring, of kinetics. Underlying those qualities is a fundamental tuning of the components of this architecture so that they can be unapologetically fragile, precarious, drawing out and stirring and opening the material so that it's capable of being sensitive, so that it offers back. With that brief glimpse, I want to speak about a painting that I came upon by chance last year. Bartolomeo Caporali was painting in Perugia around 1450, 1460. And this is a very, very traditional Christian Annunciation. The Annunciation is where the Christian God is about to be born. The mother of the God, Mary, is standing and hears the news that this mother will bear God. What an extraordinary kind of idea, and what kind of weight comes upon this rather well-known scene in the West. And let's notice that it's beautifully framed and extraordinarily constructed in a kind of an essay of the emergence of a perspective and the acquisition of beautiful figuration and the ability to depict space. This is popularly understood as a hinge where medieval work is sometimes considered, as I was taught as a young art history student, that medieval work is primitive, and we need to learn how to project perspective and parallax and find the kind of regulating lines that stabilize the world and that allow these figures to act within urban space. It's kind of a remarkable kind of achievement that I was taught. And certainly in some of the work in this painting, I see exactly that kind of lesson, this beautifully calm, figured series of columns, for example. I'm going to draw attention to the floor in just a moment, but just for a moment, I just want to emphasize that this is a painter who is extraordinarily capable in figuration. There's no question of the kind of control of the medium, of silhouettes and of figuring. And yet, when I turned to the bottom of the scene, as I did by surprise, I didn't know that I was going to find this. This was in Avignon, a lovely museum. I found very extraordinary, strange, kind of disarming treatment. What's going on in this floor? Why is it like that? Why is the paint splashing? Why is it so grotesque? Why are the brushwork somehow almost uncontrolled? How can this be? In the most important place of all, the ground upon which the mother of a future God in this religion is standing. How could this be a treatment? I tried to come to terms with this, and I found myself reading about it. And I discovered that rather than this being an accident, this is a very little known published, it's very little published about, but it's a practice of the most important place of all, the ground upon which God will rise, is too important for human control, too important for mere consciousness or mere mastery to act. And instead, the wisdom of the material itself sees through and bubbles and churns in an extraordinary release and an acceptance of the most wild, ferocious fertility. What an extraordinary faith exists in this turn of mind. How can this be possible in a time when we're trying to make things under control, when we're trying to govern, that it would be possible to release? Just to emphasize that this is not just a single extraordinary spiritual exercise in one painter, but rather, even though it's not well published and not well understood, a very, very explicit practice. Another painting, Fra Angelico, painting about the same time. This is in the monastery of San Marco in Florence. Again, a Christian story. Noli me tangere means touch me not, which is the third day after the god has been crucified and rises from the tomb and reappears to his former wife, Mary Magdalene, in the form of being a gardener. You can see the hoe on the risen God's back. And maybe you notice that there's a little shadow running down through the scene, just separating them. In the rendering of the garden, though, we see some very curious marks, along with this beautifully figured, very carefully described set of figures. A tiny little spot on the hand, stigmata, which is where the wound of the crucifixion in the Christian God's story, taken down from the torture instrument of the cross. And then resounding in every flower, a similar stigmata. Every single flower is resounding. And the way this is rendered is so very curious. Surely this wound and that expression would be the most important thing of all, treated with the greatest reverence, the greatest control, the greatest preparation, the greatest sense of reverence, the sacrament of this act. And yet, how is each of those events rendered? How are they rendered? With blotches of paint. And if we look closer, we'll discover that each one of those blotches is dropped and the paint is allowed to flux slightly. It's deliberately not touched. An extraordinary kind of inversion of the sense of the drive of civilization in the myth of humanism from the incoherent medieval into the Renaissance and into the majesty of our structured world. This sensibility, vivus mori, the holding of death in life, the release of life. As a rhetorical term, I discovered, I'm a very fresh dilettante amateur in learning this, so please share it in that spirit. Apophasis is a rhetorical term which is the opposite of trying to convince through clarity, through great organization, through preparedness, through civilization. The name for that is cataphasis, incidentally. But apophasis means not arguing, allowing things to exist. Somehow the welling of circumstance, the drifting, the wilderness of sheer fertility, of reality itself, wells up through you and produces a really extraordinary kind of fertility. This seems then to be the opposite, at least an utterly different complexion to the definition of equilibrium. If equilibrium means everything is equal and completely even and in a well-closed system and orderly. I'm going to try and dwell on these terms and try to offer them for architecture. I said I wouldn't be dwelling on the terms right now. I'm sorry, I think I have, but I'll try to move. But I made a little diagram just in an attempt to translate what I was just sharing into architecture, in the sense that, first of all, if I speak about who I am, when I experience the consciousness of who I am with you now and sense it, I have to admit that it's a fleeting mongrel myriad of bubbling impressions and floating and fluttering apprehensions, perhaps, but surely not just one clear thing. And this leaves me to speculate about an architecture that might allow a fulfillment, a kind of a sanctuary, a new kind of pomerium, a new kind of open threshold, that might allow the kind of uncertainty and the oscillation and the curiosity of the consciousness that I'm trying to share now, trying to admit, to flourish. Let me try to allow those reflections just to reside in a set of shared works, and I'm going to come back to some rather practical craft and terminology later, but let me jump right away into architectures by skipping through rather swiftly a sequence. It started many years ago in weaving together large filamentary constructions for the land, reinforcing in geotextiles, translating that into tectonic systems with the start of digital tectonics as well, with this vaulting work, which Eric and I and other colleagues started to develop as a prototype architecture at the very beginning of digital fabrication. And rather quickly, however, it became very, very engaged in an intimacy as well, in an exchange between those tectonic systems and the experience of touch, of wondering, of extending, of seeing our own experience and the physical work as being somehow united. This then resulted in a series of works where we started to speculate about the possibilities of making, in an immersive sense, first generation digital fabrication, weaving things together using filamentary structures, using many, many pieces, using textile elements in tessellations, where the work at first was very still. And then as we walked through it, using the stimulation of microprocessors in many distributed interwoven systems, the work would start to ripple and rather gently respond. This then resulted in some choruses that in some modes became symphonic and rather hopeful, such as the deeply layered symphony of the Venice Pavilion. And this deepened and wove further. The textile works started to become very, very strongly interwoven with computational systems and also with liquid systems that contained protocells, that is formulas of liquid systems that were bubbling and evoking the beginnings of life, the beginnings of the mineral origins of life, let's say, in circulation systems. And this became a kind of prototype architecture, colonnades, vaulting, column works, expanded systems using a radical minimum of material and stretching it using hyperbolic forms so that the kind of force diagrams of the ideal placement for individual filament organizations and diamond grids would be released into a sense of deep, deep potential and great strength and resilience. And this then resulted in a showering, rather thickened sense of open work veils and thresholds in a series of these installations. This one's in Hangzhou. And then wove back and started to make quite robust, strong shells that would be capable of deployment in geodesics and in dome works and in architectural systems as well. Those shells tended to be open and they became collection spaces and sanctuaries, so that the interiors of those shells became very significant as well as garden-like collecting spaces. And just down the road, perhaps you can visit one yourself, Meander, in which the quality of those rather intense works can be seen, the textile systems as well as the collections and the sanctuaries. Underlying that is a sense not of trying to manifest the greatest power or concentration, but rather a much more liminal sense in which elements could quiver and gesture and stir and evoke a sense of rather strong empathy, unlocking our own sensitivity. There's a delicious sense of trying to find the maximum precarity in very, very gentle, thin materials, unlocking the moray that encourages our own pathfinding and perception of patterns to be engaged. And that then, in the sense of rather fertile, individual, delicate, unapologetically fragile elements, is woven together and makes rather large turfs that then can invoke cascades and deeply, deeply immersive, swamp-like, kind of almost ecstatically immersive, nearly saturated spaces. Project managers have very often questioned this kind of work. Those who are responsible, let's say, for the durability of the work. And I'm rather proud to assert the tremendous durability of the work in the sense that compliance, that is, by weaving together things with multiple tough joints, the release of forces and the dissipation becomes absolutely viable. And these works have done much more than survive public spaces, but they've really performed very beautifully with a minimum of maintenance, perhaps in part because they evince a certain civic care, which is a rather different kind of behavior than the behavior that comes from a tough jail or a tough subway station. The work has become miniaturized as well. This is work that becomes a small essay, in fact, of a whole form language, which is mounted in San Jose just a couple of years ago. And you can see some of the almost jewelry-like elements, which are just as time-consuming as the architectural ones in terms of the number of pieces. But the intimacy of some of these works is a real pleasure. And this has turned also then into a sense that architecture can work in a very, very intimate scale right at the boundary of our own bodies, in the sense that this dimension, this octave, even below our skin perhaps, and immediately outside our skin, and in the layers of our clothing, and then in the layers of our own relationships, constitutes a continuum, which is a really delicious kind of set of octaves to inhabit. These works then have turned into couture. Couture understood as a possibility space, a space where we might define what we might be just for an hour or a couple of hours, unlocking, in a sense, a dreamlike sense of how we might live together. And in these expanded forms, then, it's been a tremendously happy collaboration with Iris van Herpen. There's been a rather deliberate sense in which multiple boundaries can be inhabited. Not just a polarized sense in which we are free here, but then we need to become responsible in another boundary, but rather seeking a gradient, a deeply, deeply interwoven sense of possibility. I'm going to show just one more image of work, which is taken from Venice, to try to capture a sense of the interconnection of the elements that I've just been sharing by sharing one more film, which will come on, and then I'm just going to stop speaking for a moment. This works with the sense of intense happiness and possibility that I've been trying to evoke, but also in the time that it was presented, just very recently, a time also of almost unspeakable grief. And this kind of spectrum of possibility was one that we were rather deliberate about, working with dreams, working with projections, and also working with the kind of public chorusing. I'm just going to turn this on, and I hope it's okay to listen for a second. You'll notice that there's a child that emerges in the end. The child, by the way, was the director's daughter, who was scanned and then rigged and animated, and then offered her own body and utterly voluntarily. And you'll see what I mean when you see the image.
rain from the skies. They rise from the earth. From the rocks.
The film goes on to evoke the stirring of life from the mineral origins, and then ends with a sense of cessation as the earth fades deep, deep, deep in space. Just to round out this tour through current works is a project that Tracy and I have been collaborating on most recently, called Living Shadows, which takes physical work and also takes the digital twins of that deeply interwoven work and manifests it as a virtual entity, and then shines light through both of those things and emanates shadows in which the difference between the real shadows and the virtual shadows is imperceptible because of the tuning of the light sources. And that makes it possible to generate a sense of pluripotency, that is, all of the form languages that are used to make the component systems of physical fabrication then can be animated and taken through their generative series of possibilities, of series of growth and decay. And there's a rather delicious sense of being able to see possibility in that. We're rather hopeful about this being a rather strong new art form that's rather different than trying to be photorealistic, because it's a shadow which is deliberately reductive, so that we tend to see possibilities in it. And I'll just show you one rendering of that in which a dress which was presented in Tilburg boiled with its form language and series. This is very early days for that work. I'm going to skip through some craft modes now. Just to speak about how these works are achieved. I'll try to go a little bit more swiftly. I realize I'm dwelling. In these rather symphonic, dense works, they're organized in tessellations and in groups and rather methodically. And they're translated into highly, highly robust scaffolds, which accumulate their strength and their durability through distributed systems, through compliance, through elasticity. And then they're deeply clothed with the kind of precarious systems that I was describing before. To unlock that precarity involves many cycles of drawing in which the kerf, that is the vaporization of a laser cutter, or the machining paths, or the tolerances of twisting, of turning, of radiusing of materials, is very, very much discovered and worked with, and so that each individual material is taken rather close to its limit, unlocking an extraordinary kind of liveliness in the material. It's not the same thing as trying to make something fail, but certainly we go across the gradient of erosion and let's say decay in order to get to know the performance of materials. Those then are woven together very often using chirality, that is handedness, so that things can twist and turn and then cross-link into elements. They're sorted into variations so that there's a form language and a lexicon of individual elements and libraries. Those then are clustered together into topologies of aggregates and multiple systems. And then those are very often disposed in tessellations using underlying geometries that are frequently quasi-periodic rather than periodic. When I say quasi-periodic, I mean something which might be quite regular, but sees regularity also as a kind of disease. That is the vulnerability that comes when you have a crystalline system and you can't stop a crack because of its rigidity, because of its excess of order. And so therefore the cross-linking and the multiplicity of many different vectors produces a kind of extraordinary resilience. This is a depiction of a Penrose tessellation, a 10-way division of a circle, for example, in this tile work, which is a lovely non-repeating or quasi-non-repeating system, which then can be clothed with other elements in this frond-like turf, for example, and then unfolded and used to make polyhedric systems as well, which then are organized in these kind of large arrays and then spread out and made into regional systems as well, using sensibilities that come very much from landscape and from painting. Orthographics becomes very important in this kind of system, that is, or quasi-orthographics, because these are often unfolded kind of sections where you can see the relationships between things rather than just cutting through them in a pure model where all kinds of fragmentation would happen. So these are rather organized orthographics where individual elements are unfolded and then they make the typical conditions. Then those are organized into patches and into arrays and into strips and series where typical conditions are organized, making lexicons. And this then is made into assemblies then, which are sometimes exploded and sometimes put together just directly into prototypes. When those different elements are woven together using some extremely lightweight systems and also some very robust elements, it produces a rather deep turf-like system. And then computational controls, microcontrollers are woven through, and software has been written by wonderful colleagues within the group that then enlivens this with very particular behaviors. Running along the gridworks, perhaps you can see the triangulated gridworks that I was referring to earlier as some of the guidance patterns, using these kind of underlying behavior impulses, and then translated also into some tools which make the softwares themselves, which then can be translated both for making but also for the living shadow systems in order to enliven their possibilities. I really love the tuning of this new software in the sense that underlying the making is form libraries which are ready to spring into action with a tremendous amount of potential. And so what you can hopefully see is a kind of a jittering, stuttering, kind of very curious kind of granularity, the viscosity of these elements, and the very particular granularity is one that I'm really loving. So this maybe the word quasi-periodic then becomes more meaningful when we see these dynamic tools that the studio has been developing. This illustrates the living shadow system that I was just describing a moment ago. That is to say that there's a physical immersive world, and then there's a digital twin using all of the modeling and all of the planning that we as architects know how to do, but not as simply an instruction set to execute a building, but rather as a persistent model which lives and which actively behaves and which actively guides both the configuration of the kinetics of the elements and also the projection of the work. And this interchange between the two is one that I'm just coming to terms with now, and I think it's rather early days, but I'm rather excited about the possibility. You can see then some bit more of the UI, the user interface in the new software that we're going to be announcing this year called Ether, in which influence engines can be configured and control multiple distributed kinds of patterns which exist within a milieu. And we're trying to articulate this as being a spatialized digital milieu, as being a rather significant, rather potent new area for architecture to develop language in. I'm going to shift now from craft to a set of terms. And then after that, I'll start to wrap up. I started this talk by trying to offer a set of 3 terms traditional terms. And I'd like to go over those again and just offer some ways of unlocking them using the craft that I've just offered and perhaps manifesting the projects. Starting with the word firmitas, the rather famous term so often connotes permanence by Vitruvius. When I was a little child, I had a happy childhood in a garden on the Hamilton Escarpment. And the limestone was close because the Ice Age had scoured away so much of the turf. And the sense of the ground being solid, almost infinitely deep, was one that was very tangible for me. I was surrounded by the plenitude of the woods, of the swamps, of the streams, of the farmlands. And I was held by my father and my mother. I remember sitting on my father's shoulder in the sense that they were eternal somehow. Those multiple layers of the fundament, the foundation, is one that's so fundamental for architecture, isn't it? Even if we've had an uncertain day, even if we don't know where the future is going, I think if we sit in these seats and we stand on this ground, we feel carried. That nature somehow will always be with us. I love this sense that we can live in the world and that there is depth, infinite depth underneath us, and that we are founded. What of the world? Where's the ground that we stand today? The sense that responding to that ground might offer something different than needing to control.
Hello, little girl.
Rather live
Saying
and
hello, Austin. I'm
finding,
here now.
shifting, undulating, somehow confidently finding paths,
Love it.
The little trunk. right
not
there.
through an absolute stance, but rather through a lovely sinusoidal kind of fragile exchange, is one that calls for some new terms for space itself, certainly a rather different term than stability, I think, or stasis or permanence. What does firmitas mean when we see this kind of response? In craft, we've been trying to find ways of navigating this kind of response to an uncertainty, finding precarity, finding a kind of consistency and a durability through movement and oscillation. And in this kind of exercise, we've been working back and forth, tuning, backing off a strength sometimes, making things much more durable other times, and translating that into materials which offer a kind of prototypical architecture. Here you can see some of the first steps in finding a material using that kind of metastable oscillating performance, unlocking the third dimension as well as it twists and turns, and then finding some fulfillment. So perhaps a better word than firmitas is metastable. I can't say I completely understand what that term means. some of my engineering colleagues tell me I'm using it incorrectly. But I hope that I can perhaps encourage its emergence in architecture as one of the paradigms. Secondly, I want to speak about space and the assumption I was told, rather proudly, that space is empty. When I was a child, this was my world. Continued through most of my adulthood, through the Hubble, the sense that extraordinary individual things can be seen as we look closer and closer and closer, and yet the space in between is so nearly a vacuum that the sensibility of emptiness becomes a kind of virtue, a pride, that we know, a kind of law, the second law of thermodynamics, in fact, that things approach zero, absolute zero, cold, static. And this sensibility then that order starts and decays into disorder and becomes dissolute is one that's so riddled in my culture that I think of it almost as a law. Yes, I'm alive, but I need to know that ultimately there is nothing. I'm speaking about a childhood and an adulthood of having been taught this in a Western tradition. And Newton and even Einstein have practiced this law. I've mentioned the second law of thermodynamics. I've mentioned the sense that we work from order and it spreads out and it decays and entropy constantly increases, which sets up a very curious role for architecture, I think, if this is what we believe. We need, therefore, to govern. We need to create order. We need to hold. We need to make shells around ourselves. Civilization is a bulwark against this inevitable dissolution. Extraordinary kind of new insight emerged in the middle of the century. I particularly admire the physicist Ilya Prigogine, who observed that while that equilibrium in which every action is met by another action, as Newton said, is true for a closed universe, one fixity, when the reality is that the universe is open, that energy rains through us, that the sun rains down on us, that energy continually passes through. And then standing waves emerge, oscillations, the oceans, the dunes, rippling. Prigogine observed an extraordinary thing in which entropy is not the only story, but actually a durable kind of order emerges naturally. What an extraordinary kind of encouragement. And a recent generation of physicists, particularly admire Jeremy England, have observed that living systems and humans epitomize not only standing waves and certain kinds of periodicities, but in fact also generate the kind of release from those periodicities that continually churn and generate and grow and create fertility. That life somehow, rather than needing to be built or held or defended, is inevitable if energy and information and interchange and interaction and sharing flow. An extraordinary kind of encouragement in reaction to some of the qualities and some of the thoughts that I've been sharing. And the James Webb perhaps encourages this. James Webb Telescope in its revelation of tissues, the most extraordinary kind of fullness in which space, and here's a model of almost all known radio transmissions in a part of the universe, the filamentary strings and the kind of coherence that emerges here suggests that rather than empty, inchoate, dissolute space, a deeply, deeply tangible kind of tissue, cellularity emerges. It's almost impossible not to identify with and relate to in our own organisms. Am I projecting this? I wonder how you relate to this kind of image of all known radio transmissions and what it connotes. A sense of almost warmth, of fulsomeness, is one that seems utterly different than the kind of atheism, that is to say, the technical emptiness and the zeroing of space that I was taught as a child. And this suggests to me that some new language also for space is really needed. Perhaps the word ether connotes it, perhaps the word milieu, a deep, deep kind of interwoven quality, an exchange quality of empathy, becomes technical terms that are very, very significant. Finally, the words for the pomerium that I started with, the domain, the shell, the circumscription, the making of the envelope of architecture, raises questions also when I think of a perfect sphere as being something which absolutely minimizes the amount of interaction with the world. You can have no less exposing face than a sphere, absolutely maximizes our own territory inside. Then what a curious kind of proposition as a paradigm for architecture, as if that transcendental, eternal fixity of the optimum is the thing that we should aspire to in our architecture. What kind of ambivalence then comes when we look at the forms in that light, in that cultural light? Do we see a raindrop as somehow compromised in its shivering and its quaking? Do we wish that it had a kind of perfect optimum? I want to suggest that spheres are irresponsible, perhaps even ugly, in the sense that they maximize our territory and minimize their interaction. So let me welcome a very different phase of water, snowflake, and just see that that same mass can also exfoliate and have a radical maximum of exposure, a maximum amount of interchange, a form generation then, a paradigm for architectural design, which is predicated not so much on fixity and maximizing territory and being as clear as possible, as seeking sharing, seeking exchange, seeking vulnerability. Is this a happy and desirable state of opening? My own limits are tested. My emotional limits are tested when I embrace the implications of this thesis. Do I believe that the milieu around my own body is just as alive as I am? Do I believe that as I sicken, that other fertilities take over? I need to acknowledge that this is beyond my understanding, and that the nausea of death and of the limits of suffering are with us minute by minute. And yet, somehow, the sense of participation as boundaries open does impart a kind of joy. Let me then ask for some new language for the pomerium and for the shell that speaks about opening. So I've tried to speak about a sensibility about seeing time through sensing, some new words for space, and of creating thresholds. And these words then are stretching and are improvised. They seem to draw increasingly on the language of life rather than the language of static form. And they invite a speculation that it may be very, very effective, perhaps even timely, to start speaking of living architecture. Let me sum up. I've spoken about a discovery in the exercise of apophasis, this lovely painting. I've invoked Shakespeare, and I've questioned the second law of thermodynamics. I've suggested that spheres have an ugly side, as well as a beautiful side. I've talked rather practically about the possibility of maximum exposure faces as a very deliberate craft. I've tried to offer some terms that might transform and might act as a set of new paradigms, enabling and enriching, fertilizing design. I've shared some craft of organization that make it possible to do quite complex things using tessellations and textile methods. I've tried to increase a sense, at least an exposure and experience of precarity and unapologetic fragility as an effective term for architecture, taking some lessons from nature and translating that through a set of architectural projects, choruses, collaborations. I suggested that this term then, so very often used in beauty, is a term that nature only knows in death, closed systems. That some new language is needed. Is it possible to be confident for architecture today? Is it possible to be confident for the future? Do you hope that it's possible for a sense of individual, couple, cluster, group, neighborhood and community and city and province and nation and world and universe to be something of a continuum where each of those words might be possible and where the public natures of architecture might be very, very actively practiced through involvement? So I hope that's a contribution. Thank you. Yeah, I'd be very happy if there are any questions.
If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. Jalia is on that side and I'm on this side, and we'll be able to get a mic to you.
Hi, is it on? Okay, my name is Audrey and I'm in my second year. I have a thought to say, but it's not going to come out coherently, so I'm sorry in advance. I really appreciated your vulnerability and your honesty. I know you said at the start of the lecture that you felt quite shy to be sharing things. And I think, like, in this world, I really appreciate when artistic expression is as raw as what you're doing is. And I think that looking at this is, it kind of feels like someone's soul is speaking, which I sound very like, but it feels really true. And I think that that connects a lot to how our built environment should feel and how it doesn't, and how it kind of alienates people inside of that. So I don't know, that's kind of it. I just thought, yeah.
Audrey, that's really lovely encouragement. Thank you very much. I feel very tentative about trying to offer strong things like this. And yet it does seem important to try. And this is something that I so love about the community that we are together, and the very particular kinds of experiences that we share in so many cycles, that it seems to be a community that is, on one hand, very strong, very able, and yet accomplishment is somehow not the object. Rather, viability is what we're trying to find, which means that it goes rather further than simply having the all-nighter and doing something magnificent. This is not an easy kind of space to maintain. It takes a sense of safety. And safety is very, very difficult to maintain or to find. How do we find the sanctuary of architecture? How do we find that without that hardening a kind of a boundary and privileging it just inside? I think it can takes continual involvement, but speaking about it and learning and using terms and realizing that our actions matter and that we can make a deep, deep difference is perhaps the fundament of all of that. You can use this one.
Hello, my name is Eliane, and I'm also a second year student. I really love your craft. I think it's really exquisite and complex. And I was just wondering, in that complexity, especially in the materiality, how do you account for every detail? And more is, I know in design, it's like we always want to do more. How do you kind of come to a conclusion and say, this is where I'm going to stop, instead of continuing and continuing on the design?
Those are great. Those are two great questions, and I think really important ones, because in the intensity of what new tools and new technologies unlock today, and also in the gravitas of the times, that is, that it's really, really, really important to take hold of things and get under control and do something quickly. It can be something which we feel we need to just sprint and work with the greatest intensity possible. And I think that there was certainly a period in Canada, perhaps in the early colonial period, 200 years ago, where the natural environment was thought of by the settlers as so strong, so intensely strong, that all the mastery, the intensity of technology was needed just to drive the railway through, let's say, or to clear out a piece of land. Perhaps in different times, that kind of strength, the equivalent of wartime, might be understandable. And yet, nature teaches us that when we push and push and push, then things get harder and tougher and more compacted, and they become more brittle. And that brittleness, things inexorably becoming crystalline, homogenizes and makes things extraordinarily powerful for that order. And then when other forces come and bounce off it or riddle through it, they get bounce and they get amplified, and the next weakest thing immediately outside that crystalline thing gets ganged up on and breaks. And it produces extraordinary polarization, and it produces even more brittleness and vulnerability. So therefore, force is, without some other qualities, something that we can see to be irresponsible, counterproductive, ineffective, actually. Let's not use morality too quickly. Let's just say, look at what it does. We become brittle. Rowenicus, our late beloved friend, told us to go as slowly as possible. When we look at abiogenesis, that is the emergence of life from mineral spheres, then it's become extraordinarily, well, just a revelation, let's say, that the ice ages were just as important as the periods in which the sun was raining down on the earth. When the sun rains down the earth, you get metabolisms and you get metabolites, and things plate and crystallize and embrittle quickly. When things are allowed to be sheltered, nearly like cooled, and in the shadows, deep subtlety can emerge, and extraordinary kind of multiple combinations of loops of convections and cooperative networks can emerge. The Krebs cycle, for example, I'm talking about, but technically about the understanding of abiogenesis, of the emergence of life from minerals. So if it's technically true that going slow, and that's what I'm just trying to illustrate, produces viability, in fact, is technically the origin of life. And if we can see the impulse of being as powerful as possible, then a first response to your question, I hope, is simply by being patient and listening, as opposed to jumping to conclusions. Very difficult to do. But I think it takes a certain amount of support together and a looking at practical examples. With that, then, a different set, I think, a renewed set of criteria can emerge in which, rather than the optimum, a sense of viability can emerge. The word homeostasis is a really useful one in this. Because in circular economies and homeostasis, it is the capacity to renew and to continue and to refresh that's the most important. And letting go of things, excretion, in fact, and releasing is every bit as important as accumulation and the kind of pinnacle of a pyramid. A pyramid is a symbol for an equilibrium which is known by nature only in death. And so I think that we need some new language to explore the way that architecture can offer living systems and viability. Now, I've just kind of zoomed out from your question, but I hope that those are okay responses.
Hi, my name is Karina, and
Hi,
I'm
Karina.
a first year. I just want to say that thank you so much for your work of embodying life within architecture. In my culture, we believe that everything has energy. So non-living things and living things, they have energy. And so I can see that reflected in your work. And I hope that train of thought can be applied to that. I hope that architecture can apply that train of thought to itself, life and energy.
Oh my God. Hi, I'm
Hi.
Noor. My voice is gone, so you have to bear with me. But I'm also a second year. And I was just really interested when you were talking about digital twins and what inspired you to use a digital twin to extend the experience of art through different realities, as well as what are your thoughts on this tool and how it could improve design and architecture? Because I feel like it could be a very important tool for the futuristic designs and things. So I was just curious on your thoughts over it.
Thank you. It's quite true that in this talk I was emphasizing some emerging new technology and design methods using digital twins. I mean, I would just define a digital twin as the body of design material, which is all of the pattern making, which creates the work of the built environment, but also the rigging of all of that design material, the animation of that material, so that it can become not just the permanent equivalent of what's made, but also a persistent model, meaning that it can evolve and be managed and have its own life alongside the build work. Now, when I'm giving that definition, that might sound an awful lot like BIM, building information modeling, which many people in the industry have gotten excited about over 25 years for good reason, because information management's very, very significant. But there is a rather forlorn sense in which working with Revit and BIM turned many form givers and lively designers into statistics, clerks sitting feeding in information. A new generation of digital twins, though, is something that through interfaces it has become really a very, very lively kind of work. And I'm particularly interested in the interfaces that make it possible for digital twins to be almost inseparable from physical work. And I think that we're getting rather close, let's say, to that kind of interweaving. I mean, there's still a separation, almost the fundamental separation as from ideas and action, or design and results. But when we have a deep saturation of sensing that can feed back to microcontrollers, and when that system is so distributed that it can work very close to each element, feeding back, configuring, summarizing, offering material, projecting, then it becomes a very, very interesting kind of dance back and forth. The work of the studio is really devoted to embodied playful interactivity. And we've been investing quite a bit in kits now that work with digital twins together with individual clusters and components, so that then the possibility of the work and the actualization of the work can go in many, many cycles, in a very playful kind of cycle back and forth. So I'm just giving some comments on the qualities of a digital twin. I think it's a very, very important kind of mode for architecture, which means that when we do drawings, they have consequence, and they aren't static things. They don't come just at the beginning or just at the end, but rather they continually cycle, and they take deep let's say investment to become really lively. I'm really enjoying the sense that new media can be so fertile.
Hi, Philip. My name's Aaron. I'm a. Oh, here, sorry. Hey, my name's Aaron. I'm, much like your opener, a proud ex-bad student of the architecture school. I just had a few questions. You talk a lot about atheism and entropy. Curious, with many of your projects, if you had any comment on, viewing these projects as maybe through the lens of rebelling against those prior held beliefs or currently held, I'm not sure. Whether it's, the projects against atheism and entropy, or they're a manifestation of it, or they're an expression of those things.
That's a very provocative question. And how do each of us relate to our personal histories and and the emergence of our current sensibilities? I think that there certainly could be a sense of, okay, I was like that, and now I'm embarrassed by that, and I want to be this instead. I mean, it could be like that. When I think of some of the things that I did in my teens and how I was thinking, I think it's being so ridiculous that I absolutely want to rebel against them. I must say I'm rather frightened of the energy of rebellion. because when I think about the word rebellion, I think inevitably that if I'm a rebel, then I'm taking for granted the strength of my parents or of the ruling powers or of the fundament. And so I can throw all my might, flinging myself into new possibility, but leaving turbulence in my wake. And when nature was whole, and when firmitas, when the earth had the depth that I was invoking, I think that is quite possible, almost viable, because things do heal. You know, I mean, like the world is strong. The world was strong. I listen today when we embrace the question of that strength. Who takes it for granted anymore? And that implies then to me that the kind of wholehearted rebellion which says, no, take a stand and let the chips fall where they may. And no, you know, that you take care of yourself. I'm going to do this. I just can't believe in that kind of revolutionary act anymore. I did count myself in the experiences of civil disobedience younger, very, very actively in that way. Extremely. But somehow manifestation of care now is one in which love and responsibility and anger are so deeply intertwined. Perhaps the lesson of Gandhi is still instructive, though. You know, I mean, in the sense that you can be pretty tough. If we think of nonviolent resistance and that kind of rebellion as being an act of supplication, that mythology is not true, and it was rough, but still somehow ultimately responsible and caring. So now I've just shifted a little bit from atheism, and I've talked about rebellion, but that was one of the terms that they used. So I hope that's an okay response.
Hi, Philip. My name is Kristen. I'm currently a master's student, like first semester. So right now for my thesis, I'm kind of interested in synthesizing really large ideas into the scale of the object. And since you jump scales from universes to installations to clothing, I was wondering how you kind of see, or even if you don't, the idea of abstraction as a tool of design and facilitating kind of more evocative thinking.
Abstraction is a really provocative word. Thank you for raising it. Abstraction, I'm very ambivalent about that term, and so I'm going to take a stance against it, and then I'm going to embrace it deeply. First, this talk was really a kind of diatribe against abstraction. At least I wonder if you would agree, you know, that like the sense that every action is culpable and embodied might imply something that rather different than the kind of epitome that of optima and distillation, the reductive kind of quality of thinking that I think is exemplified by Leonardo da Vinci's drawing, in which we have this lovely kind of tracing of a pure geometry, circumscribing this much more organic figure that was inside. That's the popularly the Vitruvian Man. Plato, the Greek philosopher, is very popular, associated with this sense in which a transcendental abstraction is more true, more beautiful, more necessary, more effective, ultimately holds the power to governance and order and success and truth itself. And yet, I've tried to speak about that abstraction as being something ugly, as leading us into brittleness, as leading us to equilibrium, as leading us to death. In other words, a transcendental sense of the world is something that is not necessarily one that is identified with living things. It results in stasis. Now, let me go to the other side of that question. Because if we can pitch empathy as perhaps the other side of abstraction, let's just say, okay, I was speaking for empathy instead, then empathy also is something where we are so deeply involved in feeling and seeking to connect and to cooperate that we can very quickly become enmeshed in affinities, in our tribal loyalties, in our sense of justice, in almost a righteous sense of the deep interweaving of the social compact. Empathy is involving. Being involved and opening and agreeing and conversing has its own kind of gradient. And if we enrich it and enrich it and enrich it, then nature would give us a swamp, and then we would go into eutrophy, into eutrophication, into the sense of oversaturation and being stuck, and the condition of anoxia. At least I'm just using a natural analogy to suggest that empathy is also very problematic. So then how do we work with both of those terms? And if they can be used as a kind of a dual or a couple, oscillating between them in a sinusoidal kind of rhythm, then empathy and abstraction become extraordinarily effective as a pair. So that the abstraction of seeing that life is suffering and I need the kind of geometry or pure kind of carving of something which takes me away from suffering and allows me to see something pure as being something beautiful, as a kind of a refuge, then abstraction, rather than a soul-destroying thing, becomes a kind of beautiful human construction as well. So now I'm trying to construct empathy and abstraction as being an extraordinarily effective kind of dual. Now, I'm drawing rather heavily on a German philosopher, Wilhelm Wöhringer, who wrote a book called Abstraction and Empathy in 1904, which is a really quite lovely one. That book, unfortunately, is kind of has a vector which is trying to argue for abstraction and treats empathy as being kind of like a 19th century stupidity. Whereas I'm trying to turn that around and trying to talk about a kind of homeostasis in which those qualities are extraordinarily cyclically effective for each other.
Thank you so much. Can I ask one follow-up question? Yes.
Yeah, because I know that I've gone rather past time. So should we just do one more question? Is that okay?
Okay, no worries.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I was also interested in the idea, you were talking about kind of opposing forces working together with or empathy plus abstraction. And I kind of framed my thinking with not empathy particularly, but the idea of analogy and abstraction working together as almost opposing forces to create more evocative pieces that people can look at or observe. So I'm wondering what you think then, the tool of like analogy, is that similar to empathy to you?
That's a provocative and interesting pairing. I think we can all picture what analogies are, you know, like we use something and we see something in that because that's a really good example
Yeah.
of this. And so that helps illustrate and fosters understanding. So I mean, I think this is a really important, really valuable craft in how do we conceive of things and how do we move things
Mhm.
along and how do we reveal their qualities. I think analogy is far from kind of straying from distillation and active embodied involving fundamental practice. Analogy, logos, you know, one of the cores, the kind of meaning of things might be, if we use it individually, a rather reductive term like, okay, what is the locus of something? It must be the essence, right? We need to distill, we need to strip away. And sometimes those prefixes like a or ana or apo, apophasis, you know, those terms might be thought of as negating. The a might be thought of as negating. The rather curious thing, though, is that even though that's a first way in, okay, if you have something and then you negate it, then that's like thesis antithesis, right? And when you have those two together, then in a good kind of combination, you can sublate and find a synthesis. Beautiful. Okay. However, very curious. The term a or ana or apo linguistically isn't just negation. At least not in the way the words where we see those prefixes active tend to be used. I mean, for example, abiogenesis. Abiogenesis is not just not biogenesis, genesis, the generation, biogenesis, the generation of life, abiogenesis, not the generation of life. Instead, it's the hinge in between mineral world. And that hinge is extraordinarily cyclical. And in fact, it's liminal. The limen, the gate, the sense of oscillation, of moving back and forth. And it's very tempting to say that that sinusoidal kind of oscillation is fundamental to the emergence of cognition, the emergence of sentience, to the viability of life. And so that suggests that those terms then, like analogy, might very usefully in a new practice, in a new rhetorical practice. School, we're talking about how forming thesis, to be one in which explicit ambivalence becomes almost a method. When I say ambivalent, you know, when I was young, I was really embarrassed about how ambivalent I was. I thought that, no, that means I'm weak. I have to decide. You know, if I'm ambivalent, that means I'm irresponsible. I do not know what to do. It's a tearing feeling in me. It's a rather almost cruel, elusive quality, but one that I feel rather strongly about fostering, in which ambivalence is a state of wisdom, in which it's a signal that your mind has been opened enough through empathy and through reduction, through analysis, through involvement, to see multiple sides of a situation. And yes, it may be very important if you're driven to choose. But if there's a sense of looking, and if there's a knowledge that you're already involved, then that ambivalence might be actually exactly the homeostasis, the viability that is needed for viable leadership and stewardship and for life to continue. Now, I don't pretend that ambivalence is okay in our society. I think it's still unfortunately held as a weakness, but I think it might be very well worth looking at the possibility that it's a sign of strength.